Good evening all, and welcome. We have some amazing stories for you tonight, but before we get there, I have an extra special treat. The book that I have collaborated in, True Darkness, is finally available for you to read. You can buy it on Amazon, and I think you might even be able to get a paperback version delivered to you. All the information is there. If you do choose to buy one, please know it would mean the world to me. And if you do get one, please leave a review. They really help and are greatly appreciated. It only costs a couple of dollars, and it would mean the world to me, seriously. But don't just take my word for it. I have been blessed and allowed to read the first chapter of the book. It sets the character and things start getting interesting. So if by the end of it you feel like you'd like to read more, you know what to do. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable as we enter True Darkness. True Darkness, Chapter 1. Val limped her way through London streets. They'd become very familiar to her since she'd moved here from nowhere, Wyoming. No one noticed her, not even with the bruises or the scrapes on her face. Certainly, no one noticed the blood dripping from her injured leg. Her long, black overcoat hid the majority of her injuries, but nothing could hide the trail of blood she was leaving behind. Nothing but indifference, anyway. Though she limped, she did not falter in her purposeful stride. She found keeping up a brisk pace in the city helped maintain her anonymity. The sunlight, what little penetrated the clouds and smog, was slipping fast. Val didn't mind normally. She did her best work after dark. But right now, she needed a safe place. She was hurt and needed to recharge her batteries and assess the damage. Her destination was as grey and dingy as the city sky. Mitten's Diner was a place most people slipped past. The run-down building, failing neon lights, and discolored sign implied bad atmosphere, bad food, and bad service. And the implications were generally right. Still, Mittens held a special place in Val's heart. She'd grown used to eating their bad food, drinking in the bad atmosphere, and the service, it wasn't really all that bad. She stopped outside, just long enough to take in the comforting feeling of being safe. The building was amongst one of the oldest in the city, built with wards against most of the bad elements found throughout the world. When she first arrived in London, she sought out this specific building because of some advice she received on her flight from the United States. Richard, the man who sat next to her on the plane, gave her the address. He suggested it would be a safe place to look for housing as well as work. When she initially approached the building, she felt safe and protected. The feeling alone drove her to take the gentleman's advice. She applied for a waitress job, as well as acquired a flat above the business. She'd only lived in the building for a few days before she began snooping. She found wards carved into the stones from the foundations, all the way to the roof of the building. They were so masterfully cut, they looked as if they were decorated stones or only tool marks from the original crafting of the stones. Still, she put out her own wards every night. Val only worked as a waitress for about a month, before she established her own business of helping others research and ward off the supernatural. She hadn't heard any signs of what hunted her since she arrived in London. At first, she wondered if it was the wards that were incorporated into the building. But now, she thought the passages she'd read about, and spirits not being able to cross large bodies of water to be the cause of its absence. She was grateful for this because most of her work occurred after dark. Most of her jobs were low level, consisting of disgruntled ghosts she needed to dispel. Every now and again, she'd be called in for something else. She had the pleasure of helping one woman cancel out the curse of a coven she'd angered. That one was tricky, but it taught her a lot in the ways of witches. Because of her chosen profession, this building was one of the safest in London for her and her lifestyle. She prayed gentrification wouldn't be coming to this neighborhood anytime soon. As soon as Val crossed the threshold, her tension eased a bit. She took her usual seat in the back of the diner. Even though Val felt safe in the building, she still liked to keep her back to the wall and watched passers-by through the tinted windows. After all, she'd left a nice trail of blood for whatever might be tracking her. Sue, the night waitress, immediately brought over a steaming cup of coffee and went back to the counter without a word. Val cupped the mug with both hands and brought it to her face to breathe in the heavy aroma. She only managed a few sips of the brew before Sue returned with a stack of pancakes heaped with butter and a little tin café filled with maple syrup. Val didn't waste any time in drenching the cakes with the syrup and shoving a huge bite into her mouth. "Want to talk about it, love?" Sue asked. "Can't," Val said through a mouthful of pancakes. Someone always asked her what she'd been up to when she came into the diner all messed up, but Val never confided in them. She figured they might actually believe her, but she wasn't ready to take that risk. This city held enough people with delusions. She didn't want anyone to put her on that list. But this time, Val wasn't just holding back. She truly couldn't remember. She only had brief flashes of memory littering her mind. Sue nodded and walked away to refill the cups of the other two customers who sat at the counter. Val watched the crowd outside as they paraded past her window. The passing bodies were starting to thin out, and none of them seemed to take notice of the blood trail she so generously left behind. She didn't know if she preferred it that way, or if she'd rather see her attacker. She'd woken up on a grave inside Highgate Cemetery, with no recollection of how she'd gotten there. It was a tourist trap, and not a good place to go hunting. She was out of sorts when she awoke. She didn't even think to look at the gravesite she'd been resting on. That was something she'd been stewing over for most of her walk back to Mittens. If only she'd paid attention, it might have given her a clue as to what she was doing there. A twinge of pain coursed through her leg and almost made her choke on another huge mouthful of food. She instinctively reached down and clutched at the wound, which only sent another wave of pain coursing through her. She thought she felt something inside the wound, and Val fought to keep her fingers out the gash and shoveled her pancakes down. Her leg was hot and felt swollen. This could mean something venomous, which meant she had to inspect it as soon as possible. She peeked at it between bites and was only rewarded with bloody hands and no idea of the extent of the damage. She wiped her hands on some napkins and scooped the remainder of her cakes into her mouth, shoved the bloody napkins into her pocket, and left enough money on the table to cover the bill and a thorough tip, and then hobbled her way up to her flat. The few minutes of inactivity while she ate had stiffened her leg considerably, so the stairs to her flat were a challenge. She managed the trek, but not without breaking out into a cold sweat as she accidentally led with the busted up leg. Inside her apartment, she immediately stripped off her black coat and tossed it on the couch. The sight of the bloodstain on her jeans and a clear liquid draining on the floor brought with it a flash of memory. Her mind pulled her back to the moment she woke up and amplified everything around her. A minty smell filled her nostrils, and she felt a persistent sting in her leg. Val opened her eyes and took in the vegetation and the tombstones. She sat up quickly and inspected her leg. There was a small gash in her jeans that was outlined in blood. Off to her left, she heard a loud rustling, but was way too groggy to see what was hurrying away. Instead, her mind went to the more immediate sensation of pain. She prodded at the gash, and a hot, clear liquid oozed out of her leg and onto her pants. Her senses were still dull, but she knew she had to get home. Val snapped back to the present and tried to pull off her jeans. It was no use. The leg had swollen to fill her pants so completely they were tighter than a wet swimsuit. Hobbling into her kitchen, she dug around in her drawers until slippery fingers closed around the scissors. Starting at the waistband, she cut down her pants until she neared the gash. The cold metal of the scissors and the pressure caused a rush of fluid to splatter onto the floor. The pain of it made her lightheaded, but the now familiar minty smell wafted up to her and brought her back. Val thanked the powers that be, it didn't smell as bad as it looked. She had no idea what had attacked her, but she did have an inkling that the hospital would have no cure for what ailed her. She managed to finish cutting down the pant leg and then slipped out of her jeans. A folded piece of paper fell from her laceration and hit the floor with a wet sound. Val bent over to retrieve it and ended up on the floor with the paper in her hands. The room was spinning now, but she focused and opened the paper. It was a note, and it simply read, "Squeeze the leg until the liquid is no longer clear. Get a couple of days rest, and you should be just fine." What happens next? You'll have to find out by reading the book. Link to the Amazon page is right there in the description and the pinned comment of this video. It would mean a lot to me if you would like to check it out. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. The Skinwalkers are waiting, and let the darkness take control. A number of years ago, I was driving through the woods. It was dark, and I needed to get home. I was absolutely exhausted after another day doing the late shift. It must have been about 2 a.m. at this point. I'm driving through a fairly secluded patch of forest when I notice that my car starts acting funny. My headlights turn off, and I start playing with the buttons to try and make them turn on again, to no avail. I realize this is dangerous. I can no longer see where I'm going, and if someone, as unlikely as it is, starts coming down this road, I am in serious danger. So I pull over with the little moonlight visibility I have and park my car. There I try turning the engine off and on again, but once turned off, the car doesn't start. It just splutters and dies. This was in the era before cell phones, so I had two choices: walk in the dark until I found the nearest town to use a payphone, or wait it out till morning. I wasn't entirely sure which one I preferred, as it was dark and forested, and to be fair, I knew I had a very long way in either direction to get to the nearest town. So I chose to stay in the car. I reclined my seat and started getting myself comfortable. That's when I heard something in the distance, a sound like no other. A furious cry, mixed in with a growl. It sounded like the scream of a fox, and at least a handful of other creatures rolled into one. This horrific, primal screaming. I instantly jolted up from my reclined seat and looked out the window, scanning my surroundings. The lighting wasn't very good, and I could barely make anything out past the dark tree line. That's when I realized that if there was something out there, I was showing my face, so I instantly ducked and pretended I wasn't here. The sound happened a few minutes later, this time closer to my vehicle, and a few minutes after that, there was a definite scratching and a tapping on the back of my car. I dared not look up. If there was something there, it could obviously see me through the rear window. And I told myself I was being silly. I'm in a car, I'm protected. Nothing can hurt me. I slowly twist my head uncomfortably up so that I'm still laying down but looking into the back window. And there's nothing there. With a pang of relief, I turn around to face the front window once more, which is where I see it. A creature the likes of which I have never seen. Tall, hairy, the mouth of a dog. It was horrific. Its long, bestial limbs outstretched, far taller than a human. I have no words for what this creature was. And in its own sickening way, it gave me a predatory grin, and I just about shat myself there and then. I fumbled to sit up, but was paralyzed with fear, and in a moment of bravery, as it started moving to the right of my car, as if it were going for the door, did I jolt up and spring into action. I plunged my keys into the car slot, twisted it, and by some kind of miracle the engine revved up. I put my foot on the accelerator and darted into the night. My headlights had started to work again, and I don't think I dropped below 90 the whole way home. When I reached my house at about 4 a.m., I couldn't sleep a wink. I wasn't sure what I saw, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I know many of you are hearing this and thinking I sound absolutely insane, and trust me, if I hadn't experienced what I had, I'd be in the same boat as you. But I know what I saw, and there is something out there, and I have no intention of finding out what it is. This happened a few years ago when I was mountain walking. We started as a large group, but after some time of everyone choosing their own pace, I ended up walking by myself. I was walking downhill through a thick forest area when I slipped on an unstable part of the trail, and I slid on my butt to where the path goes straight. Before I could get up, a deer walks out of the trees on my left and stands in front of me. This was not natural, because deers usually avoid human contact. Something was really off about this deer, and I wasn't sure what it was. Its eyes looked lifeless, and its aura was that of unease. Then it opened its mouth to show multiple rows of what looked like razor-sharp teeth, and made an ear-shattering scream. It sounded like nothing I had ever heard before or since. It sounded unreal, like it shouldn't exist. I watched quite a lot of horror movies, and I'm yet to come across a scream this demonic. After the scream ended, it closed its jaw and walked away to the other side of the woods. I never told this story to anyone before. I've heard the stories of other mountain walkers, and anyone who shares stories like this gets labeled as insane. But I know what I saw. Hell, I can't forget, no matter how much I try, and it still gives me a shiver to this day. This story happened during my teenage years. I lived in a small town of 2,000 people, mainly surrounded by boreal forest in Canada. This place was great, as we often saw deers, and it was usually a quiet and safe place. To put a bit of context, my house was located at the side of a dead end, and the only light source at night was my house. There was a single street light at the end of the road, but it only lighted up a part of the street and the forest behind it. We were a dog family. I only had small dogs when I lived there. Every day, we needed to let them out to pee, as all dogs do. But at night, they were almost impossible to see because of the darkness. Our terrain was kind of big, and the light sources were weak. I was a gamer at that time, and often stayed up late, so I was the one who needed to take out the dog to pee at 2 a.m. because it stayed with me while I was playing. One night, I opened the door and waited for my dog to do his thing. While trying to look at it, I was only able to see the reflection on the light in its eyes when it looked at me. I started to look around, because there were sometimes deer sleeping in the wood, under the streetlights perhaps, or wild turkeys roaming around, when a little dark spot caught my attention. It looked like a human head emerging from the bushes, but I wasn't able to see it because it was a bit in the dark. I didn't want my dog to run after whatever it was, as it had a tendency to run after wild animals, so I called it. It didn't listen to me, but the thing in the bushes started to crawl towards the street slowly. It looked like a human, with thin limbs, but a normal body and a slightly long neck. I started to freak out a bit, and shook the treats cup so my dog would hurry. It came inside running, and I shut the door as fast as I could, closed the lights in my house so I could have a view of what was outside. The strange animal crawled fast, almost running like a dog with every limb broken. As it improvised a crawling movement, the animal passed under the light, where I saw it had no fur, as a shaved animal. It was disgusting. I was afraid and standing in the dark. The animal ran towards the light and continued on the street where I wasn't able to see it because the houses in my neighborhood were delimited by trees. I locked the door and went to sleep with my dog and spoke to no one about it. A few months later, I went to bed early at 11 p.m. and went to watch some videos on my phone. They were gaming videos, and I had earphones on. A sound on the video was recurring, and I thought it was annoying, like a distant weird scream. After the video finished, I went to see another, but during the loading, the sound occurred. I removed my earphones and waited for the sound, and heard it, and had tears in my eyes. It was coming from my window. My room is on the second floor. I looked down into the forest. If there was some movement, the only light near the forest entrance was the moonlight, and an underwater light in our pool that emitted a small halo around it. I wasn't able to see anything, but the sound occurred again. It was like a mix between a distorted scream and a pig having its throat slit, or a strong pain whining from a dog. I looked down and saw an animal that passed so fast it was very hard to see. But it was human-sized with limbs crawling like a spider. It wasn't running after anything, but the sound occurred another time. It was the most horrible thing I'd ever heard. I closed my window to choke a bit of the sonority of it. I heard it again 3 other times, and it stopped after that. I spoke to my dad about the sound, and he told me it was probably a deer being attacked by a wild animal. I was so scared of it I barely walked into the woods at night the 3 years following, before moving into a city to go to university. Even this day I have never heard of an animal like that, and made me really doubt my mental health at the time. Because I had PTSD from a dog attack in middle school, and I sometimes had light hallucinations when I gamed for too long, like a black shadow that disappears immediately or things like that. There were barely any reports of wolves, coyotes or bears in my area. And believe me, I've made a lot of discoveries exploring the forest in this town. I was about 14 years old when this first thing happened to me. I was home alone during the holidays. I got a few inches of snow where I lived. I was looking out the window and saw deer tracks right by my house. I noticed that they were very close to my house, so I walked outside to check it out. When I first saw the normal deer prints, but as the steps got closer to my house, the strides got longer and longer. Then finally, as I got to the back door, I looked down and saw that the animal tracks looked nothing like an animal, as if it started to walk on two legs. It looked almost as if it were a human footprint that were about the size of mine. I froze and looked around to see the footprints continued around my house until they walked right back into the woods. I've taken a video of what I found, but deleted it because I thought no one would ever believe me, as it was hard to see the prints in the video. I never spoke about it until this next event. This was April 2018. I was 18 years old and woke up at 4 a.m. one night and was very confused as to why. I didn't have a dream that would wake me, and right as I started to fall back asleep, I began to hear this drumming. It sounded like something close to tribal drumming that you hear in old Western movies that's featured in Native Americans. I woke up with fear and rolled away from the window and pulled the covers over my head. I heard it closer and closer to my window. I could hear my brother from the other room yelling for help. My dad comes downstairs trying to figure out what's wrong when I hear him stop mid-sentence to observe the noise. He went right around my house to my brother's window and then just stopped. I went to sleep as soon as it ceased. My eldest brother came up to me the next day and asked me if I heard the drumming, along with my dad and my brother's girlfriend at the time. To add to how creepy the whole thing was, I went outside to investigate what happened, and we saw not only footprints to my window and my brother's, but no indication of where it went once it stopped playing. We also saw by the mailbox that whatever was playing the drums sat down before coming to my window. Now, I knew what a Skinwalker was before the two events happened, and I'm convinced that somehow these two events are related. It was 4 years apart, but I just can't shake the feeling of these two things that happened at my house. My family has lived in northern Maine for about 4 generations. I was born and raised here, as was my father, both his parents, my great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandmother. My parents and grandparents all had lives in which they would leave Maine and see the bigger world. They would live in New York, Los Angeles, and on a farm in Iowa. At some point, however, they would all return to the little middle-of-the-woods town in northern Maine that I have lived in all my life. 5 years ago from today, my grandfather Bruce Gray died. He was the second oldest of 5 boys, but he is the only one I ever got a chance to meet. His older brothers, Robert, and his 3 younger ones, Oliver, Joe, and James, were all killed when Bryce was a boy in 1962. Our town is surrounded by dense woods, and very few people live here. That isolation and the size of our little home meant that everyone pretty much knows everyone, and more or less everything that goes on, the folks that live here know about. Neither my parents or my older sister Eva would tell me what happened to my great uncles, and even though everyone seemed to know everything, no one in the town seemed to be able to speak about the killing of 4 young boys 57 years ago. 57 years is a long time, but not so long that these deaths should be forgotten. 2 weeks before my grandpa died, he finally opened up about what happened to his brothers. He came into my room and sat on my bed saying, "Your father and mother do not wish me to tell you this, but you aren't much older than I was when my brothers died." I stopped the paper I was writing and turned to look at my grandfather. I was stunned. He never spoke of them, and I was always yelled at when I asked questions regarding my great-uncles, even if it wasn't related to their deaths. My grandfather continued, "My son doesn't believe what happened, not since he met your mother, and became convinced that the things like my brother's deaths are impossible. He was furious when I told Eva on her 17th birthday, and I'm sure he will be even more furious when he learns that I told you." He stopped talking and motioned for me to come over to the bed with him. I moved to sit next to him, but before I sat down he asked, "I'm gonna tell you because I want you to be safe, to use what I know to protect yourself. You need to know what happened, because I am sure the same thing that murdered my brothers is still out there, feeding, living in the woods." I sat down. "I want to know what happened, the truth, why no one will tell me, and why even the mention of your brothers angers people." "Good, because this is not something I would let you hear. You're 16, 2 years older than I was, and 2 years younger than Robert. Oliver was 13, and the twins, Joe and James, were 10. We practically lived in the forest around town, exploring trails, climbing trees, chasing rabbits and other animals. We always stuck together, and in all seasons we were out there doing something." My grandfather wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at my bookcase, full of not books, but wooden animals that I have carved and placed on those shelves since I was 10, and learnt to carve from my father. He wasn't really looking at my animals, but more at the open air between them, remembering the years he spent in the forest with his brothers. It was almost July, and Robert was to go away for the summer before coming back to help our father with the store. Our father had always told us not to go more than a few miles into the forest alone. This was a rule that we always followed, until the week before Robert was meant to leave. We decided that while Robert was still here, all 5 of us would go out into the woods and spend a night or two further than any of us had ever been. We all knew how to hunt, read maps, and basic survivals from our father, and saw no reason that we couldn't. Besides, Robert was an adult now. He said the last part, dripping with sarcasm, and a sour look spread across his face before continuing with his story. We all packed bags that we used when going out with our father. We packed everything we needed, from food to flint for a fire. We all were armed with the silver knives our grandfather had given us when we turned 10. He said that they were made by the settlers of this town, and that they would never rust or dull and would protect us. They didn't. We left a note for our parents and left. Robert led us. He was the oldest and holding the map. The map didn't have any specific pathway, and after about 10 or so miles, it was just a dark green blob of the forest. In the center of that blob, some 30 or so miles off the map, is where he wanted to go. When we got to the section of the forest that the map did not show, we started cutting arrows into trees, pointing back home. We left early in the morning, and it was late in the day, I'd say 5-ish, when Robert was happy with a clearing and we made camp. The clearing we chose was small, surrounded by impossibly dense forest to every side. It was a few yards away from a stream, and the woods around us were plentiful with life. After we pitched an old tent, We set out to explore the woods near our new clearing. There was nothing remarkable, just trees and life. The sound of birds and other animals moving about it was a peaceful and beautiful thing. As he described their trek through into the unknown wilderness, the sour expression left his face and was replaced by a mixture of happiness and regret. It was long and tiring to get there, but the clearing made it worth the trip. We all seemed to regain our energy and chased each other around like half of us weren't coming up on adulthood. We had built a fire to cook a squirrel or rabbit that Robert caught for us. Robert was putting the poor animal over the fire when I first found a sign that something wasn't right in our clearing. His hands turned to fists, and the slightly happy, reminiscent tone that was in his voice vanished. I was walking around the clearing when I saw something sticking out of the ground. I pulled it up. Out the ground, thinking it was odd. It was a whitish rock. I immediately dropped it. It was a jawbone. At the time I couldn't tell what animal it was from. I'd never seen a human jawbone before, but I am now sure that it was indeed from a human. The jawbone still had a few scraps of greying meat or tissue still attached to it. I told Robert, but he brushed it off, telling me that it had been there a long time, and it was just some other animal's kill, like the one we were about to eat. We ate our kill and went to bed. The jawbone sat in the back of my mind. It worried me, you see, because I cannot say what kind of animal it came from. It never occurred to me. It could be human. I do not know when it was, but I woke up in complete darkness, and it was apparent that something was immediately wrong. The forest around our clearing was completely silent. No nocturnal animals moving through the brush. No insects humming in the trees. No wind rustling in the leaves. It was the end of June, and the forest was completely silent. Or so I thought, until I heard the only noise there was to hear. A cracked, scared voice of a woman calling for help. The voice was wrong. The words were right, and logic said that there was a woman out there in need of aid. But it was wrong, like the words were coming out of a throat that was not made to speak human languages. We were all sleeping in the old tents, and as I started to get up, Robert motioned for me to sit back down. I did so, and Robert himself left the tent. He called out to the woman and was greeted by another cry. The fire was still smouldering, and I could see the wood catch as he fed more to the fire. As Robert moved around the clearing calling for the woman to follow his voice to our fire, the others began to wake. Oliver asked me what the hell was going on. At the same instant, James asked what smelt like rotten eggs. I had no idea what he was talking about, and instead told Oliver and the others about the woman in the woods. Oliver was watching the shadowy image of Robert moving around the tent, and Joe was pulling on his hair, a habit that both the twins had when they were younger and scared. James finally spoke, but his voice was wrong, not his normal excited squeak, and not even nervous stutters. It was a cold, dead-sounding noise that made me think that James knew everything that was going to happen. The sound of that voice, coming from my little 10-year-old brother, was a terrible thing. That's not a woman. It's a man with horns. Those are the words he spoke. The words that caused my blood to run cold. The words that caused me to leave the tent and join Robert in our clearing. The woman's voice was getting closer, coming from just beyond the north side of our clearing. As she got closer, I realized that the voice was on a loop. The exact same tone, the exact little hiccup after help, and the same sob after me. I think Robert saw it too, because he stiffened in front of me and told me to stay behind him. The others had all exited the tent, and Oliver handed me my knife. Neither me nor Robert thought to get them, but Oliver had, and at that moment I was more happy to have my knife than I was to have anything else. The voice was now just beyond the light of the fire. It turned less and less human as it drew closer, and in the middle of the last cry for help, the words turned into a predatory growl. The shadow that was barely visible in the dark tree line past the fire was that of a hulking and distorted human being. It started to step into our clearing. My grandfather started to shake. His eyes widened and he went as pale as ice. His voice started to fill with fear. It was like he was back in that clearing, watching this monster approach them. "Grandpa?" I tried to pull his attention back to me and away from the horrors of his past. He just kept talking, not even realizing I said anything. The beast stood there, on the other side of the fire. It seemed to be letting us take its appearance in. It was taller than I imagined it could be. Hunched over, as it was, I swear that it was at least 8 feet tall. It was standing on 2 impossibly long back legs, ending in long, narrow feet that seemed to only have one toe tipped with a terrible dagger-like talon. Its arms, staring high up on its shoulders, were at its sides. The long fingers at the end of its arms all ended in similar black talons that seemed to absorb the light from the fire. Its claws must have been a foot long. They seemed to be brushing the dirt at its side while it breathed. It was impossibly thin, and its clay-colored skin fit its body so poorly that I could see every bone outline across the entirety of it. It had no hair, and I could see where its genitals should have been. The skin was flat and seamless. I brought my gaze up away from its monstrous body and to its deformed face. The skin was pulled just as tightly around its skull as it was around the rest of its body. Its faces resembled humans, while at the same time being completely wrong. It had no lips, just deep grooves where they should have been. This absence revealed a mouth full of crooked, needle-like teeth and a long, dark blue tongue hanging out one side of its mouth. Black saliva rolling down it like a sap from a tree. Its eyes were the worst part, like an owl's but sunken deep into its skull. They were bright yellow. It seemed to me that the firelight caused them to glow, giving off a minuscule amount of light of their own. The smell of death quickly filled and cleared, steaming from the thing that had entered. For what seemed like an endless amount of time we stood there, me and my brother on one side of the fire, and this monster on another. We studied it while it studied us, no one moving. I tightened my grip on my knife. I wanted some kind of magic protection between me and this thing. Then the spell was broken. Robert stepped backwards and his foot landed right on a stick, and the monster let out a blood-curdling yell. Oliver dropped the rest of the knives, never having the chance to give them to the others. Joe screamed and started to turn away from the beast. Robert swore and started backing up faster. James stood watching the monster as it screamed into the air and jolted forward. It moved fast, impossibly fast, faster than anything I had ever seen. As it came for us, it brought one taloned hand up, and the next thing I knew was that the arm Robert had started raising to protect his face was missing half a foot of itself. Joe was running with Oliver not far behind. James was still standing, staring at the beast as its mouth full of crooked needles closed around Robert's throat. I grabbed James by the arm and started to drag him with me. I did not need to drag him far, as he started running as fast as he could on his own. I kept hearing ripping noises from behind me, but I kept running behind the others, trying to keep them all in sight. The tearing noises stopped, and around me the wind picked up out of nowhere. The wind was blowing from behind us, from the clearing. It was pushing us along, blowing leaves to chase us, bending trees to look down at us, severing branches from trunks to attack us. Though the wind roared in my ears, I could hear the crack of the branch and thought of the cloud of dirt and leaves blocking my vision. I could hear the branch strike Joe ahead of me. He had started crying when he described how the monster lunged at Robert. He continued crying and told me Oliver and James had ran ahead. I had to shove James forward to keep him from stopping for Joe. I stopped for him, threw the branch off him and stopped. He was breathing still, short and uneven breaths, but still breathing. The branch hadn't killed him, but it had broken his skull. I did not know what I should do, but neither did I have any time to think about it. The wind had passed me, and even though I could still see its ripping branches of trees in the pursuit of my brothers, the smell of death was suddenly in my nose again, all around me, never ending. A growl filled my ears, and an impossibly solid, impossibly skinny, impossibly strong stick hit me in the back and sent me flying. To this day, I do not know why I did not die after it threw me across the forest floor. Somehow, I did not splatter against a tree or fall onto rocks. The blow did not break my back, though it should have, as its talons did not slash me in half like I was made of paper. Somehow, I fell 10 or 15 feet away from the monster that had pulled about Joe's head and started devouring its contents completely unharmed. I wish I had yelled, tried to do anything to save Joe, to save Robert, but I did nothing. I turned away from the monster and its feast, and I ran. I ran in the direction I thought James and Oliver went, and in a matter of moments I saw them, ahead, and to the right of me, running faster than I thought anyone as small as them could possibly go. I caught up to them, and we ran until we reached a wide open, moving river that we could not possibly cross. The wind had died down. It was no longer a powerful gale, but a light breeze carrying a haunting siren that seemed to emanate from the deepest part of the forest. The siren got louder, more consistent, and the wind picked up, freezing cold despite the fact that it was the end of June. It was there, seemingly appearing with the wind, not a foot behind Oliver, before I fully comprehended the figure behind Oliver. It grabbed him, one arm wrapped around his middle, the other his arm, cutting into his arms. In one moment, Oliver's arms were ripped from his body, and the monstrous claw disabled him. Oliver fell into the river, with his organs sliding into the ground. James and I looking on in horror as the beast. He stopped talking, no longer able to continue through his emotions. I had tried to comfort him, but he never even noticed that I was still there with him. A few moments after he continued, I ran at that bastard with my knife in my hand, yelling. I wasn't thinking. I just knew I needed to kill it. It swatted me like a bug. I flew into the base of a tree, but somehow I was still unhurt. I sat against the trunk of the tree, looking at the knife in my hands, dazed before something thick and warm dripped onto the back of my neck. I looked up, into the distorted evil face inches from my own. Its eyes were a bright fluorescent yellow, and they really did give off their own light. They were sitting in what looked like a congealed blood, never blinking, and its pupils were like pinpoints. Blood covered its needle-filled mouth and dripped down its dark tongue, mixing with its black saliva. It started reaching for me, and without thinking, I brought my knife up, slashing its face and cutting through one glowing yellow eye. The beast screamed in pain before rushing backwards. Its face was smoking where I parted its skin. I took the opportunity to run, passing Oliver's corpse and grabbing James's arm one last time to pull him with me. Unlike earlier, James was frozen. He allowed himself to be dragged, but would not run on his own. I dragged him through the woods, all the while pained howls possessed the air around us. It took us hours, but I had thought that we had gotten away. It was still too early in the morning to see much, and I sat James under a tree so we could rest a short while. James told me he had seen the monster in his dreams before. He said 3 days before we left, he dreamt that Robert, Oliver, and Joe would be cut to ribbons, and that he, James, would be left running through the woods screaming how his feet were going to burn him up. He had trouble telling me this, because he was weeping almost uncontrollably, but somehow he got to sleep, still weeping. The last thing he asked me was, why do I still smell rotting meat? He never gave me time to answer. James was plagued with terrible night terrors that caused him to scream out and talk incomprehensibly in his sleep. Nothing I did could wake him or calm him down, and eventually I must have started to doze. The next thing that I knew, my ears are full of screaming, louder and further away all at once than they were a moment ago. It was James screaming, and I quickly saw that his clothing, which were illuminated by the first light of the morning, was strewn across the ground in a small path leading away from where I had been sleeping. I started following the clothing and saw James, yards away, running faster than he had at any other point that night, screaming at the top of his lungs. I ran after him, and for a time I was gaining. As I got close, I could hear him saying, "It's so hot, it's burning me up." I was almost on him. I was going to grab him, but he jumped over a pit, and I didn't quite see it until my foot got caught in it. I fell, twisted my ankle, and hit my head on a log. James screamed about the thing burning him up, and it was the last thing I heard before I fell unconscious. He stopped speaking, and I waited a few moments for him to continue, but he didn't. "What happened?" I finally asked. He started, seemingly forgetting that he was telling me this story. He stood up and told me to follow him. We left my room, descended the stairs, crossed through the living room, and entered my grandfather's room. The walls were covered in paintings of dark woods that my grandfather had illustrated. The painting that I never really thought about before looked strangely ominous. He had been deathly quiet all the while we were walking to his room, but as he opened up his closet and started rummaging through it, he spoke again. After going back to where we had slept, I collected James' clothing and the knife that I had left behind when chasing after him. The sun was almost directly overhead when I finally limped back into the trees we had carved arrows into. It was starting to get dark again when I made it back to the house. We never found James, or any remains of the others, and within a year, I left this terrible town we live in. I left to study the occult, to study the monster that attacked us. When I discovered its name, what it could do, everything from that night made sense. It was a Wendigo, a deformed, cannibalistic human spirit made into a monster. It consumes human flesh, it can mimic human voice and control the weather. It's a monster of unimaginable strength and speed. It tears people apart and can make them go mad with fever. I think that's what happened to James. After years, I came back here hoping to find it, to kill it. How did you know it wasn't already dead? I knew it was still alive, you see, because they can live for hundreds of years before the spirit moves on and possesses a new host, corrupting them and either merging with the new soul or destroying it. He had uncovered an old wooden trunk that was covered by years of junk piling up in the back of the closet. He was having trouble pulling the trunk out of the closet, so I got up and helped. As we worked, he spoke. I spent years looking for this monster, going into the woods, searching for the Wendigo, but I never found him. Sometime in my 20s, I found the silver knives that we had left behind in the clearing. I found other things too, body parts in trees, a cave where I think it once lived, cuts in trees and rocks left by its talons, but never the beast. We got the trunk out and used an old key on a string from around his neck to open it. Inside was an old revolver, a sheathed knife, and 3 leather-bound journals and countless pencil drawings. My grandfather motioned for me to look through the trunk contents. I had an old acquaintance of mine melt down my brother's knives and turned the melted silver into bullets. I wanted to use those bullets to kill it. I put the gun down carefully on the bed and picked up the knife. The sheath was well made, leather dyed a dark blue, with golden symbols sewn into it. The sheath was obviously newer than the knife, whose leather hilt was old and worn by use and age. I unsheathed it, revealing a silver blade as sharp and embellished as the day it was made. My grandfather was right. The knife never rusted or lost its edge, and I carried it with me every day for over 20 years. Resheathing the knife and placing it next to the revolver, I took out the 3 journals. In those, I wrote down everything I learned about the mysteries of the world. They contain information on many mythical items and people that I encountered. I always wanted to give them to your dad, but he never accepted the truth of our world. It broke my heart when he refused them. Unopened, I set the journals down in a stack next to me. Taking one of the many stacks of drawings and shifting slowly through them, one of the drawings showed a creature like the one my grandfather had described, the Wendigo. But others showed images of people with fangs, living trees, creatures with the faces of different animals, spirits, and ghouls. A few showed not monsters, but men, women, and children, all massacred in various ways. About halfway through the stack, I put it down and looked up at my grandfather. He was watching me, studying my reaction, trying to see if I believed what my father refused to. "Are all of these real?" I asked quietly. "All of those are not only real, but things I fought. There are more than just Wendigos out in the world. Countless evils share this plane of existence with us, and I've come across many here in my time. After each battle, I would draw the monster that was my opponent. It helped me cope with what had happened and what I need to do. When I did not save a victim, I drew them as I found them, as a way to remember them, and to strengthen my resolve to save the victims of the next monster." I started to put all of the items back into the trunk, before pushing it back into the depths of the closet again. "I did not tell you all this so you could rush out and try and find that Wendigo, those woods, and the beast that stole my brother's lives and destroyed mine. I did not want that for you. I told you so you know what's out there. The thing that preys on humanity, even though it's not my purpose. If you ever decide you need to know more about the things out there, then go through my journals. Call my old contacts. They already know you might reach out." Before anything else was said, my father entered the room. Furious, he sent me out. Before I had even closed the door, he was yelling at my grandfather for poisoning me with those ludicrous monsters of his. I did not ever speak about the Wendigo or any other monster to my grandfather again. I did not know what I wanted to do. I couldn't go back to the innocent childhood that I had been enjoying before our talk. I couldn't just march off to kill monsters either. I didn't want to die like my great-uncles, and I had not developed my need to save others. 2 or so weeks after I learnt about the Wendigo, my grandfather walked into the woods and never returned. When I realized where he had gone and that he would not be returning, I rushed into his room. I once again pulled out the trunk, meaning to break open the lock if I had to, but there was no need. Resting on top of the trunk were 2 items, the key and a note. I read the note first. To my only grandson, I have decided to find the Wendigo that murdered my family. I do not plan to kill it. I do not think I'm able to. Instead, I plan to let it kill me, so that when I see my brothers again, we will be on equal footing. We will have known the same hardship and the same death. I feel the need to see that monster one more time, and this is the only time left. I'm leaving you everything in this trunk. Do with it what you will. Do not be controlled by revenge like I was. If you try to hunt down the monster, do it for the living and not for the dead. I know that you are a better man at 16 than I ever was, and I love you for it. Goodbye, my grandson. Love, Grandpa. I read his note 3 times before carefully folding it up and putting it in my pocket. I unlocked the trunk and opened it. Everything was exactly where I had put it weeks before. The revolver and the knife were still untouched. My grandfather brought no form of protection with him to face the Wendigo. I reached for the gun, intending to run after him and fight the Wendigo to save him. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up his first journal and thumbled through it until I came across a list of names. Each name was accompanied by a phone number, and I realized that these were my grandfather's contacts. In the 24 hours that followed, I called every number in that list and started forming my own journey to leave my little hometown and learn the truth of this world. 5 years have passed since I left home, and I've only been back for a week. In that week, my room has changed a lot. The comic books are gone, so are the fantasy novels, the piles of homework, the toys I used to play with. Even the animals I used to carve are missing from my shelves. In their place, 3 newer wood carvings sit. A horned snake with 2 tails, a man with tattered wings and the leg of a goat, and a dog with 3 heads. These 3 carvings are all the images of the 3 monsters I have killed since leaving here. At the foot of my bed, there's a trunk containing 3 old journals, a revolver, a silver knife with a new leather grip to match its sheath, as well as old books, one of which is specifically about the legend of the Wendigo, and 2 new knives, one of silver and one of iron. In front of me is my very own journal. Inside is the note that my grandfather wrote for me, the details of all 3 of my other hunts, and this entry. I am writing this in here because I'm going to enter the forest tonight and kill the Wendigo. I plan to leave this here in case I do not return, so that my family will know what happened to me. Whether I live or die, I want you to know that I have a life I'm proud of. I've saved lives and have made this world a little safer and filled with fewer monsters than when I found it. I do not plan for this hunt to be my last, and will do my damnedest to come back for this journal, but I know it doesn't mean I will. I love you all. Dean Gray. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's Native American cryptids horror stories. So basically, skinwalkers and wendigos, and some unknown stuff. If you did, please be sure to let me know. And if you enjoyed the start of the book, the first chapter, and you'd like to read more, it would really mean the world to me if you could check it out. The link is in the description, and it would be super awesome if you would consider buying a copy. And if you do, please leave a review. It's not very expensive, and I just hope you guys will consider it. In any case, a huge thank you as always to all my lovely patrons whose names can be seen on screen for all your help and support. It really does mean an awful lot. So thanks, guys. If there's a story of something terrifying that's happened to you, feel free to share it. Send it to my email or my Reddit. But anyway, for now guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.